This was something that was written a few days ago, but updated slightly yesterday or last night. Donald Trump was the most spectacularly unqualified major party presidential nominee in American history. A lazy, self-absorbed political neophyte, a demagogue and fabulist, Trump ran a campaign devoid of both policy substance and human decency. He feuded with the Republican Speaker of the House and was disavowed by dozens of prominent party leaders, including 4 of the last 5 Republican nominees. Conservative intellectuals rejected him in droves. Ross Douthat characterized Trump's message as, quote, "We've tried sane, now let's try crazy." But the remarkable lesson of this election is that crazy is not disqualifying. Despite all his manifest flaws, Trump has won an astounding victory. One Democratic member of Congress said last week that a Trump presidency was, quote, "never talked about in much depth because the guy is such a joke. We can't fathom it and therefore are not planning for it," end quote. They better start planning. In his fictional account of American fascism in the 1930s, It Can't Happen Here, Sinclair Lewis had a small-town newspaper editor contemplate the rise of a Trump-like figure. Quote, "Nasty enough, but what I've got to keep remembering is that Windrip," this is his presidential candidate, "is only the lightest cork on the whirlpool. With all the justified discontent there is against the smart politicians and the plush horses of plutocracy, oh, if it hadn't been one Windrip, it had been another. We had it coming, we respectables." My question is, did today's respectables have it coming? Liberal commentators have blamed Republican politicians for fanning the flames of white nationalism. Some on the right acknowledge that the campaign, quote, "has revealed dark and disturbing things about not only Donald J. Trump, but also the party that nominated him," end quote. But it isn't just Trump or the party that nominated him. Political scientists have long recognized that most ordinary citizens have only a tenuous grasp of the presuppositions and complex obligations of democracy, the rights it grants, and the self-restraints it imposes. Thus, political elites serve as the major repositories of the public conscience, if anyone does. But Americans' attachment to an unrealistic folk theory of democracy has made the position of political elites increasingly untenable, bolstering Trump's appeal. Trump is a textbook case of how unrealistic democratic ideals can exacerbate the dangers of real democracy. The people are supposed to rule. Thus, we've made our presidential nominations more democratic in crude populist terms, diluting the ability of political professionals to scream out amateurs and demagogues. Meanwhile, the failure of ordinary citizens to vote on the basis of issues and ideology, as the folk theory of democracy prescribes, leaves elected officials on both sides in the grip of activists, donors, and their own ideological convictions. Thanks. Some frustrated citizens respond by tuning out. Others choose up sides and follow their own party, all the way to crazy. Yes. So what I want to do is to talk about the meaning of elections in general, drawing upon the book that was mentioned in the introduction, which was published last spring by my former teacher, Christopher Aiken, who's a political scientist at Princeton, and me. And we talk about what I mentioned in the piece, what we call the folk theory of democracy. This is the idea of popular sovereignty in which policy choices are perceived to exist, and the alternative selected and enforced as governmental policy is the alternative most preferred by the members of the relevant political community. So the idea here is that elections are about translating the policy preferences of ordinary citizens into public policy. Or as one of my favorite philosophers from the early part of the 20th century put it, democracy is the theory that the common people know what they want and deserve to get it good and hard. But there are a lot of problems with this idealistic notion of democracy. One is the logical indeterminacy of preferences themselves. What's the most preferred alternative in a world where we have lots of complicated policy choices? We boil them down somehow to a yes or no, or an A or B, or a Republican or Democrat, but that's a simplification of the complications involved in actually aggregating preferences. There's also psychological indeterminacy at the individual level. People's preferences turn out to be strongly shaped by framing effects and context dependence. For example, you can ask people about their political views and get systematically different answers if there's an American flag visible in some part of the room. You don't have to call attention to it. It's just that the flag triggers thoughts in their minds that produce different policy preferences. Now, I don't know how you could possibly say that the preferences that people express with the flag in the room are somehow truer or more genuine than the ones that they express without the flag in the room, or vice versa. I think all we can do is say that what they want depends on the context in which we ask them and the specific wording by which we ask them. Then there are a whole bunch of problems with respect to political ignorance. Political scientists in the last century have tried to come up with workarounds of various sorts, information shortcuts and heuristics. None of those actually turn out to work as well as we would like in terms of getting rid of the impact of the fact that people just don't know very much about politics. And then finally, what I'll call the illusion of issue voting. I think a really good example here is in work done by Gabriel Lenz at Berkeley, who studied the issue of Social Security privatization in the 2000 presidential election. Most of you probably remember that that was a big issue in 2000, was the subject of hundreds of ads in the last weeks of the campaign and lots of political discourse. What happened was that over the course of the campaign, people's views about Social Security privatization became increasingly strongly related to their intentions to vote for either George W. Bush or Al Gore. And that's exactly as what you would expect if the folk theory of democracy was working, if people were translating their policy preferences into vote intentions. But if you look at detail, as Lenz did, at what people thought at various points along the way during the course of the campaign, it turned out that that increasing relationship between their policy preferences and their vote intentions was almost entirely due to the fact that they were changing their policy preferences to match the way they were already going to vote. The people who preferred George Bush learned along the way that he was in favor of Social Security privatization, and so they increasingly decided and told interviewers that that was a good idea. The people who were going to vote for Al Gore for all kinds of other reasons heard him say that this was a bad idea, and they increasingly believed that it was a bad idea and said so. But there was almost no instance in which people were actually changing their vote intentions to match up with their issue preferences. I think that's a very common pattern, one that we often don't see with respect to issues that have been contentious between the parties over a long period of time and where people have well-rehearsed preferences that match up with their partisan predispositions. The result of all of these problems is that the folk theory doesn't work very well in terms of what we actually expect of it, in terms of the relationship between citizens' preferences and what actually happens in government in Washington. Here's a kind of summary of that problem, looking at the behavior of members of Congress. So the vertical axis here is a summary of all the roll call votes that were cast by members of Congress over a 2-year period, from the most liberal down at the bottom to the most conservative up at the top. Along the horizontal axis are the preferences of their constituents in their own congressional districts as measured by a scale of 10 or 12 specific policy issues, ranging from the most liberal districts on the left to the most conservative districts on the right. You can see that there's some relationship within each party between the conservatism or liberalism of the district and the conservatism or liberalism of the representative, but it's a pretty modest relationship, and that relationship is swamped by the distance between the expected behavior of a typical Republican and a typical Democrat representing constituents with identical political preferences. If you look at the moderate districts, some of which elect Republicans and some of which elect Democrats, the representatives behave vastly differently because they're not really constrained by the preferences of their constituents. Here's a similar kind of picture with respect to presidential candidates. The dotted line in the middle reflects the views of swing voters. These are the people who are undecided between the candidates and most likely to turn out in a given election on an ideological scale, again from the most liberal at the bottom to the most conservative at the top. And then the red and blue lines represent the positions of the Republican and Democratic presidential candidates. The folk theory of democracy suggests that if they somehow get out of whack, they're going to be constrained to move back to the position of the swing voters. You see there's no tendency in that direction over time. The Republicans are reliably much more conservative than the electorate as a whole. The Democrats are reliably much more liberal than the electorate as a whole. Well, given those kinds of failures of the way we usually think about elections and democracy, political scientists have come up with an alternative story about what might be going on called retrospective voting. Here's a kind of summary of how that's supposed to work. Retrospective voters need not know the precise economic or foreign policies of the incumbent administration in order to see or feel the results of those policies. In order to ascertain whether the incumbents have performed poorly or well, citizens need only calculate the changes in their own welfare. If jobs have been lost in a recession, something is wrong. If sons have died in foreign rice paddies, something is wrong. If thugs make neighborhoods unsafe, something is wrong. If polluters foul food, water, or air, something is wrong. You can get the hang of this notion. We're making it easier for voters by not requiring them to have preferences about every conceivable policy that the government might face. Rather, they just have to monitor how things are going and reward or punish the incumbents appropriately based on good or bad conditions. And so political scientists who've written in this tradition have suggested that it's a kind of a salvation, for voters who don't know very much about policy. Election outcomes are not irrational or random or solely the product of past loyalties and habits or of campaign rhetoric and merchandising, or more simply, voters are not fools. But we want to suggest that this retrospective voting is harder than it looks. One issue is whether voters can reliably discern changes in their own welfare. If you think back to issues like crime and the environment, it's not at all obvious that people can monitor whether crime is up or down. There was a lot of talk in this election about the increasing crime all across America. Most people in surveys almost always tell you that crime is increasing, even though there's been a huge decline in the crime rate all over the country over the last 20 years. So it's not at all clear that people know whether thugs are making their neighborhoods unsafe. Similarly, with polluters fouling food, water, or air, the Environmental Protection Agency did a survey about 20 years ago now of how serious citizens thought different kinds of environmental problems were. There was no relationship at all between how serious the citizens ranked these different problems and how seriously the EPA experts ranked them. And so they launched into a big education campaign to try and bring public perceptions into better line with the scientific realities about what was actually happening with respect to food, water, and air. So it isn't at all obvious that people can monitor these conditions reliably. And even if they could, they would still have to ascertain whether the incumbents have performed poorly or well. The fact that things are going well doesn't necessarily mean that the incumbents' policies have produced good outcomes. And similarly, the fact that things are going badly doesn't necessarily mean that the incumbent president's policies were ill-chosen. So what aspects of voter subjective well-being are plausibly attributable to incumbent leaders' policies or performance? Well, that's a very difficult question. Even experts wrestle with a lot of uncertainty in trying to answer that sort of question. So it's hard to see why we would think voters would do it very well. But in order to explore how this works, we thought about looking at some instances in which it seems unlikely that the incumbent president was responsible for good or bad conditions. This is a series of events on the Jersey Shore exactly 100 years ago in the summer of 1916. You have to read them from the bottom. First, in Beach Haven at the beginning of the 4th of July weekend, somebody was killed by a shark. There was a lot of skepticism about what had actually happened because scientists believed that sharks would not attack people, especially this far north. And so the New York Times headline, "Dies After Attack by Fish," didn't even commit itself to the idea that this was in fact a shark attack. But then less than a week later, a little farther north at Spring Lake, there was another incident where somebody was killed by a shark. And then almost another week later, not even on the shore, but up a creek off the bay from the Atlantic Ocean at Matawan, 2 more people were killed by a shark. And by this point, people were up in arms. You can see the headline here, "East Coast Begins War on Ravenous Man-Eaters." There were all kinds of stories about what was going on. Some people suggested that the Germans had somehow put the sharks up to this. The connection between the shark attacks and the Wilson administration was intensified by the fact that President Wilson was himself from New Jersey and in fact was in the process of trying to find a summer home on the Jersey Shore. Some members of his cabinet already lived on the Jersey Shore, and so there were emergency cabinet meetings, people sent out in boats with shotguns and all kinds of things going on. But I think it would be wrong to think that the Wilson administration should somehow have prevented this shark from arriving in New Jersey. Nonetheless, there's pretty strong evidence that voters punished the Wilson administration in the election a few months later. The first bar here is Wilson's performance in New Jersey as a whole by comparison with the previous election. You can see he gained just a little bit by comparison with 1912. In the two shore counties that were affected by the shark attacks, he lost a little bit. And in the two specific towns where people were killed, you can see that he lost 8 or 10 percentage points by comparison with how he did in the 1912 election. By comparison, the Great Depression produced shifts of about the magnitude of those two that you see on the right. So this was a pretty powerful reaction to, yes, a bad event, but not one that we think probably was in the control of the elected officials. Similar kind of story over the entire 20th century with respect to droughts and floods. Again, it's probably not the case that the incumbent administration controls whether it's too wet or too dry, but in most cases, those where the bars go to the left, the incumbent president's party is being punished for bad climatic conditions in different parts of the country. In 2000, which is the last election down there at the bottom, we estimate that Al Gore got about 7 million fewer votes than he would have if everyone's rainfall and soil conditions were just right. Okay. There is a strong relationship between economic conditions and how the incumbent party performs. This is the record over the post-World War II period, the relationship between the pattern of income growth and the incumbent party's performance. There are two wrinkles that are important here. One is that it says along the bottom, 10-year adjusted. What that reflects is that there's another important factor going on here. The longer the incumbent party has held the White House, the harder it is for them to win again. People desire change from time to time, and so the kind of threshold for evaluating incumbents gets steeper the longer they've been in power. The other thing that I want you to note here, though, is that the growth in real incomes that we're measuring are over a 6-month window in the middle of the presidential election year. The president's been in office for 4 years, probably has controlled the economy as much as he's going to be able to for 3 of those 4 years, but voters seem to be fastening on this short period in the immediate run-up to the election in determining whether they're going to reward or punish the incumbent. That's a problem if that short-term period is a bad indication of the incumbent's performance over his entire term in office, much less a bad guess of how well he's likely to do if you re-elect him. And indeed, here's what the relationship looks like between these short-term income changes and the overall performance of administrations. The solid line in the center there is the average level of income growth for each administration. So if you wanted to reward or punish them for their economic performance overall, that's the variation that you'd be trying to capture and respond to. The dots are the individual quarters' income growth. And so you can see just by looking at the picture that if you pick 1 or 2 of those dots and use them to guess what the solid line is doing, you're not going to do very well. It's essentially a crapshoot. And so we end up concluding that voters are voting on the basis of these economic conditions, as the retrospective theory of voting suggests, but not in a way that's likely either to reward or punish incumbents for actual economic performance, or to be a good prediction of whether they're going to produce good economic policies if they're reelected. So the logic falls apart here pretty quickly when we pay careful attention to the details of what voters are actually doing. And even in the Depression, it turns out that there's a similar kind of pattern of myopic responsiveness to economic conditions. People talk about Roosevelt's landslide in 1936 as being maybe the most important instance of an election in which there was a popular ratification of an ideological shift in policy. But it turns out that how the economy was doing in each state in 1936 was a pretty good predictor of whether Roosevelt gained or lost votes. Real incomes increased by 10 or 15 percentage points, huge gains in 1934 and 1935. As best we can tell, those had no effect at all on the election. What mattered was whether things were going well in 1936 or not. We have a kind of back-of-the-envelope calculation that if the recession that hit in 1938 had hit in 1936, FDR would have been a one-term president and the New Deal would have been stillborn. Well, if those aren't working, what is it that voters are actually doing? Our story is that they're voting mostly on the basis of identity and group attachments and their loyalties to symbols that reflect who they are and what kinds of groups they view themselves as part of. And there are analyses of various examples of this. In the book, the upper left one is an old map of Boston from the 1930s. We report on the reaction to the Depression and the New Deal among different ethnic groups in Boston. It turns out, although they were facing essentially the same economic conditions and the same policy choices, the Irish and the Italians and the Jews and the Negroes behaved very differently in their response to those conditions, depending upon how they viewed them through the lenses of their ethnic group identities. The upper right instance is John Kennedy in 1960, a Catholic candidate who won a huge majority among Catholic voters and lost a lot of support among Protestant voters, not for any plausible reasons. I mean, people argued that the Pope would be invited to sail up the Potomac in a barge and take over government policy, but I don't think anyone seriously thought that Kennedy's Catholicism was a big policy issue. It was a matter of identity, both for and against. The lower left is Lyndon Johnson signing the Civil Rights Act. Most interpretations of the huge shift of white Southerners from the Democratic Party to the Republican Party starting in the 1960s had to do with a response to this big policy shift, the Democratic Party's willingness to take a strong stand in favor of civil rights. But what we show is that people's attachment to the idea of being white Southerners was more important than their policy preferences, and that the white Southerners who were shifting to the Republican Party were really no more conservative in their views about segregation and civil rights through most of the 60s and 70s by comparison with the ones who remained Democrats, and that the big policy differences between white Southern Democrats and Republicans on those issues only emerged gradually after much of the shift in their partisanship had already happened. And then finally, on the lower right, the issue of abortion, where we use long-term re-interviews with the same people to show that some people shift their partisanship in response to the parties taking strong positions on the issue of abortion over the course of the 1980s and 90s. Other people, in substantial numbers, shifted their views about abortion to bring them into line with their partisanship. So we have lots of instances in which people are apparently taking advice about the most momentous moral issues you can imagine from their party leaders. And then, of course, we have Trump. Trump doesn't figure in our book at all since it was written before he arrived on the scene, but I think we can interpret what's happened in 2016 in a way that's pretty consistent with the argument of the book. Here are two bits of analysis that I think are relevant. This first one is the same picture you saw before, showing the relationship between economic conditions and the incumbent party's performance, and the X marks the spot there is about what you would expect in the 2016 election on the basis of economic conditions during the election year and the fact that the Democratic Party had already held the White House for 8 years. It looks like it's going to be a close election. Political scientists have all kinds of models that vary in their details, but most of which predicted more or less the same thing. Some thought that the Republicans were likely to win by a little bit, some thought the Democrats were likely to win by a little bit, but all of them suggested that it would be a close election, but with a fair amount of uncertainty, and those arrows represent basically the statistical uncertainty associated with this kind of prediction on the basis of what we've observed in the past with respect to presidential election outcomes. Here's another picture which I put together this morning based on the preliminary returns for states. It's the relationship between how well Romney did in each state in 2012 and how well Trump did in each state in 2016. You can see that Utah is a big outlier there, partly because Romney was a Mormon candidate and had a stronger Republican vote in 2012 than Utah had shown before. Also because there was a Mormon candidate who got a lot of third-party votes in Utah this time, and so Trump did less well than he would have otherwise. But aside from that big outlier, most of these states look like they're performing not so much different than they have before. Now, political scientists and pundits have come up with and will come up with all kinds of explanations for why Trump won. Some focus on economic anxiety, some focus on cultural anxiety, some focus on authoritarianism, some focus on racism, some focus on sexism. There are all kinds of explanations that have been trotted out. But in some sense, I think all those explanations are a little bit beside the point, because what happened in this election is really not much different than what we've seen in previous elections. Most Democrats voted for the Democratic candidate, regardless of who she was. Most Republicans voted for the Republican candidate, regardless of who he was. There was a lot of wiggling around that had to do with this uncertainty associated with the overall historical pattern, and we got what was, as we say in the book, essentially a coin toss. So what's good about democracy? In spite of all of that, we have some comments about this, not as well fleshed out, stuck in the last chapter of the book. One is that all concerned abide by the toss of the coin. Even if it is a coin toss, the fact that everyone agrees on who won is really important in terms of mitigating violence. I was concerned about this one when I presented it over the course of the last few months, but judging by what we've been able to hear so far today, it looks like this is in fact going to hold. The second point is that the randomness of election outcomes prevents any single party or group from becoming entrenched in power. That's probably a good thing. The fact that voters get tired of the incumbent party the longer it's been there, and that there's a lot of randomness in the election outcomes virtually assures that we're not going to have continued run of any one party or any one group controlling the policy-making process. Neglected groups, if not too unpopular, are attractive targets for recruitment, making democracies relatively inclusive. You can certainly think of examples to that generalization, the treatment of African Americans through much of the 20th century, for example. But generally, politicians like to get more votes, and if they can get more votes by appealing to some group, they're likely to do that. And then finally, re-election-seeking politicians strive to avoid salient violations of consensual norms. And really, the issue here is how far we can go in terms of consensual norms. Strangling kittens on national television, we're pretty sure is going to be a vote loser. But how consensual these norms are, I think, is a really important issue, and one of the things we've seen, not only in this election, but especially in this election, is a kind of breaking down of the norms of elite behavior that I mentioned in the piece that I just read to you. So I want to leave you with this final thought from a political philosopher almost 20 years ago now. To be ruled is both necessary and inherently discomforting as well as dangerous. For our rulers to be accountable to us softens its intrinsic humiliations, probably sets some hazy limits to the harms that they will voluntarily choose to do to us collectively, and thus diminishes some of the dangers to which their rule may expose us. To suggest that we can ever hope to have the power to make them act just as we would wish them to suggests that it is really we, not they, who are ruling. This is an illusion, and probably a somewhat malign illusion, either a self-deception or an instance of being deceived by others, or very probably both. Thank you. Questions, comments? Ma'am. The Electoral College. There is a reform movement, a kind of workaround of the Constitution in which a variety of states have pledged themselves to cast their electoral votes for the popular vote winner if there are enough states that sign up for this contract to make it binding. There's a lot of uncertainty about whether that would work or how it would work. The most obvious problem is that we really don't have any authoritative tally of the national popular vote. Each state is responsible for tallying its own votes. And so if Tennessee comes in and says, we had a 10 million vote majority for Trump, it's hard to know how that would be adjudicated since technically they're allowed to certify their own election results. So my guess is that if this was actually tried, it would probably create a lot of difficulties and a lot of uncertainty. A cleaner way to reform the system would be constitutionally to change the manner of election in the Constitution. I don't think anybody believes that that's likely to happen because there are people who benefit from the current situation, especially small states. One of the deals we made to get a country, a United States, was to give some extra power to the small states through the Senate and the Electoral College, and it seems unlikely that they would be eager to give that up.
I was wondering, who picks the electors in the college?
Mm-hmm.
Who picks them? How do they get chosen?
Who picks the electors? Well, this is an instance, I think, in which the shift that we describe in the book toward an increasingly simple-minded populist notion of democracy has been counterproductive. It used to be that the electors were actually selected based on who they were in their relationships with people in their community. Now they're essentially ciphers, so the candidates pick the people that they want to be the electors, and you as a voter don't even see who you're voting for as an elector. You just vote for these electors who are, they say, pledged to support Clinton or pledged to support Trump. So if all goes well, they're completely invisible in the process. One of the loose ends is that they can and sometimes do vote for a candidate other than the one that they're pledged to vote for, and that's a problem. But generally, they're supposed to not have any role in the system. There's a similar kind of pattern more recently with respect to the presidential nominations, which I think is even more troubling. Lots of Republicans, I think, would have wished to have more elite influence on the nomination process this time around because it was so unruly, so many candidates, and in particular a plurality winner who many of them strongly opposed. But there's really no way at this point for elites to have a legitimate role in the process. On the Democratic side, there are superdelegates, and so they would have some opportunity to keep the train on the rails if they thought it was necessary when the convention came along. But even that's kind of a rickety solution because the superdelegates are heavily pressured to vote in consistency with the primary votes that are cast, even though the primary votes are cast by a very small and unrepresentative sliver of the entire party membership. So I think this is an instance in which our focus on making democracy as democratic as possible in a kind of simple-minded way has created real problems. And back. How is the number of electoral college votes determined? There are two components of it. One is that every state, no matter how big or small it is, gets 2 electoral votes. And then beyond that, they get a number of electoral votes that's equal to the number of representatives that they have in the House of Representatives, which in turn is based on the population of the state. So there's a little bit of a bonus for small states corresponding to the bonus that they get in the Senate. But essentially, it's proportional to their population. Yes? How accurate are the census figures for population? Pretty accurate, but not nearly as accurate as we pretend when we're using them for this purpose. I was involved, I lived in New Jersey before I came here, and I was once involved in redistricting the state legislature in New Jersey. And the rule there was that the districts, as much as possible, had to follow county lines, and so it kind of simplified the task. But there was a separate process to draw the boundaries for congressional districts, and there, because of the way the courts have interpreted the one man, one vote principle in federal elections, they had to draw boundaries so that every district had the same number of people exactly in it. So if one district had 3 more people than another one, they'd have to move somebody over in order to avoid getting sued for that. Of course, that level of accuracy in terms of dividing up the districts is way beyond the accuracy of the census and really kind of silly. But that's the way it's done. Yes? The major difference between selecting parliament and selecting the way we do it, the major difference is that the prime minister is automatically the leader of the party in parliament that has a majority, if any party does, or if there's a coalition government, the leader of the coalition is a member of parliament and at the same time the prime minister. And as a result, there's, in most cases, a mandate for the party to pursue whatever policies it said it was going to pursue during the course of the campaign, because the person who's setting policy and bringing it to parliament has, theoretically at least, support from a majority of parliament. Here, since we elect the president and the House and the Senate separately, it's often the case that we have divided government with one party controlling one of those branches and another party controlling the other branch and producing essentially gridlock as a result. Yes?
Is there any correlation between state educational level and the voting outcome?
Correlation between education levels and voting outcomes. You certainly can't see it in this picture, but there is some shift in the relationship between education and partisan support over time. It used to be the case 50 years ago that on average better educated people were more likely to be Republican and less educated people were more likely to be Democratic. Now that relationship has basically switched. In this election, especially I think in large part because of the tone of Trump's campaign and the nature of his appeal, the people who were indoctrinated into those democratic values that I described in the little piece that I read to you were put off by Trump's style and less likely to support him than they were to support the last few Republican candidates, whereas less educated people were more comfortable with that or didn't care one way or the other whether what he was saying was in some ways violating what had been taken to be the norms about democratic behavior. And so Trump did a little better than recent Republican candidates among the less educated and a little worse among the better educated. Yes?
Wouldn't it approach a more, if each state divided their vote for the electoral college, some states do, if all of them did, wouldn't that approach a more popular vote outcome?
Yeah, how about states splitting up their electoral votes? The states that have done it in a way that for most of the country would not make much difference, which is to say they've divided up the vote into congressional districts and assigned one electoral vote for each congressional district that a candidate wins. And so that's not in general going to produce an outcome where the electoral votes of the state are proportional to the votes in the state. You could have 51% of the vote, but if you have 51% of the vote in every congressional district, you'd still get all the electoral votes. So you'd have to have a more thoroughgoing rule about proportional representation, I think, in order to entirely overcome this mismatch between the popular vote and the electoral vote. Yes? Yeah, how do you get incumbents out? It turns out that state-level executives, governors, follow more or less the same kind of pattern. There are some instances in which the governors will continue to be from one party over a long period of time because the state is so skewed in its partisanship in one direction. But even in those cases, it's harder to get reelected the longer the party has held the state house. But this definitely doesn't seem to hold for legislative elections. And that's another problem with the system, I think, that people have very different views about Congress as a whole. At the last time I looked, I think the approval rating for Congress was 10% or something like that. Nevertheless, virtually all of the incumbents who were running in this election got reelected because they're good at appealing to the people in their own district. The districts often include such a preponderance of people from one party or the other that it's hard to gin up a serious challenge against those people. So I think that's another instance in which the kind of accountability that we would like the system to produce is unlikely to be produced given the way it's actually implemented. Yeah, way in the back. Yeah, so what happened to all these people who were supposed to have been offended by Trump's campaign? I think part of the answer is that some of them weren't as offended as we thought they were, but simply weren't answering the polls. But I think a lot of it, especially in the case of well-educated women who were resisting Trump, who were disproportionately Republicans, is that in the end their partisanship trumped their concerns on this score. I think this picture suggests that, you know, partisanship is a hugely important force in contemporary politics. I have here some examples of how that works. This is summarizing over a long period of time what people say about their own ideological positions. So across the bottom here, we have people's placements of their own ideology from the most liberal to the most conservative. And then what I'm showing you is whether they think they're closer to the Republican Party or the Democratic Party. So the people on the top right there are conservatives who think they're closer to the Republican Party than they are to the Democratic Party. That makes sense. The people on the bottom left are people who are liberals and think they're closer to the Democratic Party than they are to the Republican Party. That makes sense. But what makes less sense is the upper left. These are liberals who are Republicans and manage to convince themselves that the Republican Party is just as close to their liberal positions as the Democratic Party is. And then on the right, the conservative Democrats who manage to convince themselves that the Democratic Party is just as close to their conservative positions as the Republican Party is. I think these are good examples of the extent to which people can twist perceptions of reality in order to bring them into conformance with their own partisanship. Here's another example of a different kind. These are responses to a question about the budget deficit in 1996. During Bill Clinton's first term in office, he reduced the federal budget deficit by more than half. And so the correct answer to this question, has the budget deficit gone up or down, is that it went down a lot. So everybody should be up at the top of this picture if they're actually responding to reality. And I've arrayed people's responses here on the basis of political information, how much they know about politics, how politically aware they are. The people down at the very bottom who know nothing, care nothing about politics, are essentially responding randomly. They're basically saying that it went up just as likely as saying that it went down, and similarly for Democrats and Republicans. Then as you move to the middle of the picture, the people with average levels of political awareness, you see that there's a pretty strong systematic tendency for Democrats not changing at all. They're not responding to reality. They're just doing the same more or less random stuff that they were doing at the lowest information level. But among Republicans, you get systematically more wrong answers the more informed they become through that middle part of the curve. What's happening there is that these average Republican voters are sufficiently aware to know that it would be embarrassing to them as Republicans if a Democratic president was having this huge policy success. And so they deny it increasingly as you get out to about the two-thirds level of political information. And then only at the very end do they begin to trend upward in response to the actual fact that the budget deficit has declined substantially. I mean, in this case, it's the Republicans who look weird, but there are similar examples where Democrats are doing the same thing. We all have a huge ability to reshape our perceptions of the world in order to match up with what we would like it to be. Yeah. Is Trump going to be put on trial for molesting a 13-year-old? Not as far as I know. Yes.
What is your guess or perception as to whether there will be any change in the makeup of the Republican or Democratic Party?
Change in the makeup of the parties. Well, there's always some change, but very slow. And again, I think, well, I lost my picture. Again, I think this picture suggests that the people who decided to vote for Trump are really not much different from typical Republicans, and the people who decided to vote for Clinton are not much different than typical Democrats. There are longer-term processes, essentially Democrats increasingly appealing to the growing minority groups and the Republicans trying to hang on as long as possible to a competitive position based largely on the support of white voters. In the long term, that's going to be untenable, and so the parties are going to adjust. There have been lots of speculations by pundits about the emerging Democratic majority, and even in the run-up to this election, lots of people thought, well, this is just one more step along the inevitable march to a large, more or less permanent Democratic majority. As I suggested, I don't think that's going to happen because parties are always responding to the situation that they're in and making whatever changes they have to make in order to remain competitive. So there will be changes in their coalitions and in their platforms to adjust to these changes as they occur over the course of the next 30 years. Yes? How will their identities and positions change? Well, it'll be interesting to see. It would be foolish of me to pretend that I know the answer, but I'll guess. My guess is that they won't change a great deal, partly because I think the party establishment will tend to reassert itself some in relation to Trump as the governing process goes on, but also because, as I say, it's not obvious to me that there's been any big shift revealed by this election pattern. I mean, people talk about the big division within the Republican Party, but the division that we see within the Republican Party is really more or less the same one we've seen over a significant period of time. And in a two-party system, any major party is going to have lots of big, difficult-looking divisions. People aren't going to neatly pile up completely into two distinct groups. So on both sides there will be coalition juggling, but I don't think there will be any big shifts in support. Maybe it'll be the case that the Republicans will postpone longer and more completely this idea of trying to shift their positions in a way that would appeal to a more diverse electorate. You probably remember that after the 2012 election, there was a party commission that wrote a big report saying, we're having problems here. We're going to have to figure out some way to appeal to these people. Trump came along and showed that they can win in a different way, at least in the short term. And so that may tamp down the movement within the Republican Party to adopt something more like a kind of George W. Bush strategy of broadening the Republican coalition. If the campaign was normal, will the presidency be normal? I can't imagine that it will be, but that's not my area of expertise. Once I get them elected, somebody else has to worry about how they govern. Sir.
With the exception of the slide that's up there now, I don't recall any other slides of information that took into account geography. Northern Republicans have been campaigns versus southern, eastern versus western. Do you do analyses along geographic lines?
Analysis along geographic lines. In this book, mostly not. There is a section that I mentioned in passing that focuses on white Southerners and the shift in their support over the last half century. But mostly we're looking at overall patterns rather than specific regional patterns. The most important one to bear in mind, I think, in sorting through the discussion that's going to happen in the wake of this election, there already has been a huge amount of focus on the white working class and how the white working class has shifted to the Republicans. Over most of the period up until now, that's been true almost entirely of Southern white working class voters. Outside the South, they really hadn't shifted very far toward the Republicans before this election. The results in places like, you can see West Virginia and Iowa here and some other states that have larger than usual proportions of white working class voters that are a little bit more favorable to Trump than you would otherwise guess. And so that's a kind of indication that there probably has been some movement in other parts of the country besides the South in those voters' attachments. Whether those are specific responses to Trump's appeal and his style, or whether they'll somehow get baked into the DNA of the Republican Party over time, I think is an interesting question, and we won't know for quite a while. Ma'am.
How much of the Libertarian Party affected, I had presumed it would affect the Republican vote, because there were many disenchanted Republicans as part of the Libertarian vote. It seemed to me that now that we can expect that statistically they affected the Democratic Party.
What was the effect of the third-party vote? We won't know for a while, I think. The first instinct is always to take those votes and add them onto one side or the other and say that they were decisive in determining the outcome of the election. That's almost always a bad idea, because when we get around to looking in detail, it turns out that those people are almost always relatively low information, not very ideological, and drawn from a kind of weird mix of backgrounds. So you would think that, somebody like Jill Stein, who's a kind of consistently liberal left Green Party candidate, would draw entirely from Hillary Clinton. That turns out not to be the case. She's drawing votes from a variety of places. And again, I think that reinforces the point that I made in the presentation, that the idea that voters are voting primarily on the basis of issues or ideology is really confusing and mostly misleading. My co-author and I did a piece about patterns of support for Bernie Sanders during the primary season, and pointed out, based on exit polls and some other survey data that we had, that Sanders voters were a little more liberal than Clinton voters, but really not much different on a whole bunch of issues, including the ones that he spent all of his time talking about, like the minimum wage and government spending on health care. Where they did differ mostly was in terms of these demographic characteristics and social group loyalties. Clinton appealed much more to women than Sanders did. She appealed much more to African Americans than Sanders did. She appealed much more to Democratic identifiers than Sanders did. In all those respects, it looked as though the breakdown in the primaries was really a kind of cultural and social identity breakdown in which the people whose groups were most connected to Clinton were strongly in support of Clinton, and the people who weren't were more likely to defect to Sanders. Yes, ma'am.
Mr. Trump, President-elect Trump, he won by, everything's going to be fabulous, everything's going to be great. He seldom made a specific policy. I mean, we're going to build a wall, we're going to do this, everything's going to be wonderful. You really think he can put together a cabinet of people who can truly govern? Because he doesn't strike me as a man who wrote for an answer, who could possibly stand up and say, you know, honey, I don't want pot roast. Do you think he can cobble together a bunch of people to actually have policies to govern? The people he talk about, between Trump and Giuliani and Duke, they have 9 wives. I mean, maybe that's great for them, but can we actually have a policy to govern? We need a policy.
Can Trump cobble together a cabinet and a government? Well, I don't think he does yet. I think he's going to be inventing it as he goes along. The indications that we've gotten so far about the composition of the cabinet is mostly people of the sort that you seem to have in mind, kind of high-profile people who've supported him through thick and thin and may not have a lot of expertise in the particular areas that they're being talked about. But the more important problem, I think, will not be the cabinet, but the rest of the government. A new president has to appoint, I don't know what the number is, 3,000 high-level officials who are going to run all the activities that the government engages in. And where those people are going to come from, I think, is a big question at this point. A fair number of Republicans stuck with him, and so in that sense probably are eligible to serve in a Trump administration, but there are a fair number as well, including people with experience in previous Republican governments who've repudiated him pretty strongly. And so there are 2 questions, in my mind at least. One is whether he's going to welcome them back, and the other is whether they're going to want to be welcomed back into the government. And if not, where is he going to find people to run it?
I'm sorry, but this lady has raised her hand at least 10 times.
I'm sorry.
Actually, you may kind of have answered this with the last question, but my question was, considering that Trump has no military experience, no experience in government jobs, and now he's our president-elect, I wondered what you would say would be the 1 or 2 biggest problems that we as a country are going to encounter because of his inexperience and temperament.
What problems will we encounter because of his inexperience? I don't know. There are lots of candidates for that list. Which ones will actually turn out to be problems? It's hard to say. One of my friends, a political scientist, has been saying over and over for the last year that Trump might be a problem for the country but be great for political science because we get to observe all kinds of situations that we don't typically observe. What happens when an outsider blows away the party establishment and wins the nomination? What happens when a candidate basically doesn't bother to run advertising? What happens if there's really not much in the way of a get-out-the-vote effort at the run-up to the election? What happens if a candidate basically doesn't have much to say about most of the major policy issues facing the country? And in all of those cases, I think what we've seen over the last year has been really informative about understanding the way democracy works. As I've tried to suggest today, I think the overall pattern is broadly consistent with this argument that I've made about the way democracy works, but I think we'll learn a lot going forward about things like the importance of experience and the importance of temperament and what kinds of areas a new president can find his way in, what kinds of leadership skills he can bring to bear that are actually going to make a big difference in terms of running the country. So many people who supported Trump said some version of, I like the fact that he speaks his mind and that he's going to change things. So whether a candidate like Trump can change things in spite of his lack of experience and his difficult relationships with the party establishment and so on. I think will be interesting to observe. We'll see. Yes?
4 years ago, the Obama group was celebrating the accuracy of their polls, how right on they were. This year, virtually everybody missed it. What happened?
What happened to the polls? The polls, I think, actually were not really much further off than we might have expected. The person who I pay most attention to in this domain is Nate Silver, and I don't know how much you followed his work, but last weekend he was being ridiculed all over the internet for the fact that he said that Trump had a 1 in 3 chance of winning, which was much higher than any of the other analysts were granting. And that reflected mostly the fact that he understood that there's real uncertainty even at the last minute with respect to the relationship between what the polls will look like and what the actual election outcome will be, especially in a situation like this where so many of the circumstances of the election are so different than what we've been used to in recent elections. But also because he understood that the errors in the polls in different states are likely to be correlated with each other. So if a candidate does better than the polls would have suggested it in North Carolina, it's pretty likely that he's also going to do better than the polls suggested in Florida and so on. And so even a little bit of uncertainty in each state can blow up to the point where things can shift pretty radically over a short period of time. I think that's really the way to think about it. I don't think there were a lot of people who were waiting until the last minute to make up their mind, but there are problems with translating poll results into predictions of election outcomes, mostly because we don't really know who answers the poll, who is actually going to turn out to vote, and on the other hand, who's going to turn out to vote who doesn't answer the poll. Most of these polls now have response rates south of 10%, and so it's in some ways kind of embarrassing scientifically that they work as well as they do. I think we're going to, over time, have to invent some different way of monitoring what the public is thinking and how the elections are going to turn out. It's been an increasingly difficult problem. Yeah. Did Comey have an effect on the outcome? I think if he did, it was probably a small effect. There was certainly a little bit of shift in the polls, timed to match up with his first announcement about going back into this new batch of emails. It's hard to know, though, whether that was a response to the event or whether it was just that these people were, Republicans deep down who were at the point where they had to decide that they were going to come back to Trump and the Republican Party. So my guess is that if there was an effect, it was probably a small effect.
Add on to that question, in addition to Comey's behavior right before the election, there seemed to be a lot of leakage from FBI offices in D.C. and New York, things we really haven't seen to any great extent from the FBI over the years. It's a little scary to me that our main law enforcement entity nationally is starting to get very political in terms of its behavior.
About the FBI. Yeah, I mean, this is an example of one of the sort of norms that had been accepted, norms of elite behavior over a long period of time that seem recently to have broken down. That's in part, I guess, just a kind of reflection of the fact that the whole political system has become as polarized as it has, but I think it's also a problem with the fact that elites are, as I tried to say in this piece that I read to you at the beginning, increasingly unconstrained by the preferences of ordinary citizens because of this set of institutions we have that allow us to pretend that we're somehow going to translate people's preferences directly into the choice of candidates and therefore the policies of government. My own view is that much of what happens that's important is going on at the elite level, more or less disconnected from the concerns of ordinary citizens, some of whom, like you, have some sense of what the FBI has traditionally done and view this as being a kind of breach of their usual protocol, but most of whom don't really have any clear idea about what the standards are in this regard, and if the behavior is consistent with their own partisan preferences are likely to think that it's probably okay. Yes?
What factors contribute to the rise of populism? We've seen populism as a part of both parties' campaigns, and is there a cycle within the United States voting electorate that has it rising and falling, rising and falling? Is there a chance that that will be a factor in the next election?
Well, most analysts seem to think that it was a factor in this election. I don't think we have any very clear idea about the extent to which that was true or why it was true. A couple of my colleagues, I should say, for those of you who are interested, I organized a symposium on elections in America that appeared in August through the Annals of the American Academy of Political and Social Science. And if you go on the Annals website, I think you can still get access to all the articles that were published as part of that symposium. One of them was about the rise of the Trumpenvolk, as they were called, by Eric Oliver at the University of Chicago and Wendy Ron at University of Minnesota. They analyzed people's attachment to three different kinds of populism, one of which had to do with distrust of political leaders and the political system, one of which had to do with distrust specifically of science and expertise, and one of which had to do basically with patriotism or American nationalism, and looked at the relationship between those three kinds of populism and support for Trump and other candidates, and found basically that Rubio appealed to the people who were big on American nationalism. Sanders appealed to the people who were big on distrust of political leaders and the political system. Cruz appealed to people who were distrustful of experts, especially in comparison to traditional religious and moral authority. And Trump appealed to all three of those groups. He put together a kind of coalition of different kinds of populism. They also suggest in that piece that there is a cycle, not a regular cycle where you can time it and see that the next eruption of populism is about to arise, but rather that it seems to be responsive to people's frustrations about the gap between the political parties, and so it's a kind of response to political polarization in their story, and the fact that, you know, people, especially people who don't have any very strong ideological views themselves, see the Democratic Party way out on one end and the Republican Party way out on the other end. That frustration kind of breeds increases in the salience of this kind of populist impulse. And if that's right, that would help to explain why we're seeing it now, perhaps. Yes?
Were you or any of your colleagues in the political science department surprised at the outcome, or did some of you all see it coming?
I didn't take a survey, so I'm not sure if somebody saw it coming. I certainly didn't. I think people generally were surprised. On the other hand, I want to calibrate the level of surprise. As I said, Nate Silver, whose work I respect a lot, had Trump at, like, you know, 1 chance in 3 or 1 chance in 4 going into the election. There were others who were using the same data but massaging them in different ways, who said that Clinton's chance of winning was, you know, 99% or 98%. That struck me as being ludicrous all along. There is really a lot of uncertainty when it comes down to it in terms of election outcome. So if I was asked to bet, you know, at this time yesterday, I would have guessed that Clinton was going to win. But I'm not as surprised as the 98 or 99%ers would have been. Yes?
We have a pretty good sense, I think, of why the South changed after '64 from being largely Democratic to largely Republican. What are the trends? What's the sort of general knowledge of why the party change has occurred? States that were traditionally Democratic, or constituencies that were traditionally Democratic, are becoming more Republican. Beyond the civil rights.
The big shift by far is that one, looking especially at regions or states. There have been shifts with respect to other kinds of demographic groups. Evangelical Christians, for example, became significantly more Republican over the course of the 1980s and 90s as the party was increasingly appealing to the kinds of issues and symbols that were important to them. But I think it's easy to overstate all of these shifts, and especially to overstate the shifts that we're seeing now. The picture that I showed you of the relationship between state votes in 2012 and 2016 is one in a series that I've done of all the elections going back to the 1870s and looked at the relationship between successive elections. And there have been periods in which they've fluctuated massively from one election to the next. For example, the period through the 60s and 70s, partly but not only for the reason that you're talking about, showed huge swings from one election to the next and differential swings in different states. The one that I showed you is really pretty typical of what we've seen over the last 30 or 40 years, which is not very much change, a lot of stability in partisan patterns from one election to the next. And so in spite of all the crazy stuff that has happened over the last 40 years and all the crazy stuff that happened yesterday, we're actually in a period of political stability by that kind of measure. Ma'am. One more, ma'am. Would a strong third party be viable? There are always wishful attempts to construct third parties. The most recent one that I saw was by David Brooks. I think it was in Monday's paper. They always have two features. One is that the third party happens to pursue exactly the kinds of policies that they personally prefer. And the other is that it's constructed in such a way that the two existing parties are equally extreme in some dimension that the voters are supposed to care about. That kind of pattern, I think, is really unlikely for a whole variety of reasons. Most importantly, probably the strength of the attachment of most voters to the existing parties that we just saw in action yesterday. The other thing about third parties is that in the voting system that we have, they're not going to get anywhere unless they can win a plurality in a state. And so regionally based third parties like George Wallace's movement in the 1960s are in some sense viable in the sense that they might actually get electoral votes and make some difference to the outcome of the election in that way. But third parties that appeal to people more or less across the board, across the country, really have a hard time getting over that threshold of being able to win electoral votes in the system that we have. So I would say it's unlikely, in spite of the wishes of lots of people who, for one reason or another, are dissatisfied with the choices that they have before them at any given time. Thank you.